A holy terror. There was an entire lack of interest in the latest arrival at Hurdy-Gurdy. He was not even christened with the picturesquely descriptive nickname, which is so frequently a mining camp's word of welcome to the newcomer. In almost any other camp thereabout, this circumstance would of itself have secured him some such appellation as the white-headed conundrum, or no save, an expression naively supposed to suggest to quick intelligences the Spanish quien sabe. He came without provoking a ripple of concern upon the social surface of Hurdy-Gurdy, a place which to the general Californian contempt of men's personal history superadded a local indifference of its own. The time was long past when it was of any importance who came there or if anyone came. No one was living at Hurdy-Gurdy. 2 years before, the camp had boasted a stirring population of 2,000 or 3,000 males, and not fewer than a dozen females. A majority of the former had done a few weeks' earnest work in demonstrating to the disgust of the latter the singularly mendacious character of the person whose ingenious tales of rich gold deposits had lured them thither. Work, by the way, in which there was as little mental satisfaction as pecuniary profit, for a bullet from the pistol of a public-spirited citizen had put that imaginative gentleman beyond the reach of aspersion on the third day of the camp's existence. Still, his fiction had a certain foundation in fact, and many had lingered a considerable time in and about Hurdy-Gurdy, though now all had been long gone. But they had left ample evidence of their sojourn. From the point where Injun Creek falls into the Rio San Juan Smith, up along both banks of the former into the canyon, whence it emerges, extended a double row of forlorn shanties that seemed about to fall upon one another's neck to bewail their desolation, while about an equal number appeared to have straggled up the slope on either hand and perched themselves upon commanding eminences, whence they craned forward to get a good view of the affecting scene. Most of these habitations were emaciated as by famine to the condition of mere skeletons, about which clung unlovely tatters of what might have been skin, but was really canvas. The little valley itself, torn and gashed by pick and shovel, was unhandsome, with long bending lines of decaying flume resting here and there upon the summits of sharp ridges, and silting awkwardly across the intervals upon unhewn poles. The whole place presented that raw and forbidding aspect of arrested development which is a new country's substitute for the solemn grace of ruin wrought by time. Wherever there remains a patch of the original soil, a rank overgrowth of weeds and brambles had spread upon the scene, and from its dank, unwholesome shades the visitors curious in such matters might have obtained numberless souvenirs of the camp's former glory. Fellowless boots, mantled with green mould and plethoric of rotting leaves, an occasional old felt hat, desultory remnants of a flannel shirt, sardine boxes, inhumanly mutilated, and a surprising profusion of black bottles distributed with a truly Catholic impartiality everywhere. The man who had now rediscovered Hurdy-Gurdy was evidently not curious as to its archaeology, nor as he looked upon the dismal evidences of wasted work and broken hopes, their dispiriting significance accentuated by the ironical pomp of a cheap gilding by the rising sun, did he supplement his sight of weariness by one of sensibility. He simply removed from the back of his tired bureau a miner's outfit a trifle larger than the animal itself, picketed that creature and selected a hatchet from his kit and moved off at once across the dry bed of Injun Creek to the top of a low, gravelly hill beyond. Stepping across a prostrate fence of brush and boards, he picked up one of the latter, split it into 5 parts and sharpened them at one end. He then began a kind of search, occasionally stooping to examine something with close attention. At last his patient scrutiny appeared to be rewarded with success, for he suddenly erected his figure to its full height, made a gesture of satisfaction, pronounced the words "Scary," and at once strode away with long equal steps, which he counted. Then he stopped and drove one of his stakes into the earth. He then looked carefully about him, measured off a number of paces over a singularly uneven ground, and hammered in another. Pacing off twice the distance at a right angle to his former course, he drove down a third, and repeating the process sank home the fourth and then the fifth. This he split at the top, and in the cleft inserted an old letter envelope covered with an intricate system of pencil tracks. In short, he staked off a hill claim in strict accordance with the local mining laws of hurdy-gurdy, and put up the customary notice. It is necessary to explain that one of the adjuncts to hurdy-gurdy, one to which the metropolis became afterwards itself an adjunct, was a cemetery. In the first week of the camp's existence, this had been thoughtfully laid out by a committee of citizens. The day after had been signalised by a debate between two members of the committee, with reference to a more eligible site, and on the third day the necropolis was inaugurated by a double funeral. As the camp had waned, the cemetery had waxed, and long before the ultimate inhabitant, victorious alike over the insidious malaria and the forthright revolver, had turned the tail of his pack-ass upon Injun Creek, the outlying settlement had become a populous, if not popular, suburb. And now, when the town was fallen into the sere and yellow leaf of an unlovely senility, the graveyard, though somewhat marred by time and circumstances, and not altogether exempt from innovations in grammar and experiments in orthography, to say nothing of the devastating coyote, answered the humble needs of its denizens with reasonable completeness. It comprised a generous 2 acres of ground, which with commendable thrift but needless care had been selected for its mineral unworthy, contained 2 or 3 skeleton trees, one of which had a stout lateral branch from which a weather-wasted rope still significantly dangled. 100 gravelly mounds, a score of rude headboards displaying the literary peculiarities above mentioned, and a struggling colony of prickly pears. Altogether, God's location, as with the characteristic reverence it had been called, could justly boast of an indubitably superior quality of desolation. It was in the most thickly settled part of this interesting domain that Mr. Jefferson Doman staked off his claim. If, in the prosecution of his design, he should deem it expedient to remove any of the dead, they would have the right to be suitably reinterred. This Mr. Jefferson Doman was from Elizabethtown, New Jersey, where 6 years before he had left his heart in the keeping of a golden-haired, demure-mannered young woman named Mary Matthews as collateral security for his return to claim her hand. "I just know you'll never get back alive. You never do succeed in anything," was the remark which illustrated Miss Matthews' notion of what constituted success, and inferentially her view of the nature of encouragement. She added, "If you don't, I'll go to California too. I can put the coins in little bags as you dig them up." This characteristically feminine theory of auriferous deposits did not commend itself to the masculine intelligence. It was Mr. Doman's belief that gold was found in a liquid state. He deprecated her intent with considerable enthusiasm, suppressed her sobs with a light hand upon her mouth, laughed in her eyes as he kissed away her tears, and with a cheerful "ta-ta" went to California to labour for her through the long loveless years with a strong heart, an alert hope, and a steadfast fidelity that never for a moment forgot what it was about. In the meantime, Miss Matthews had granted a monopoly of her humble talent for sacking up coins to Mr. Joe Seaman of New York, gambler by whom it was better appreciated than her commanding genius for unsacking and bestowing them upon his local rivals. Of this latter aptitude, indeed, he manifested his disapproval by an act which secured him the position of clerk of the laundry in the state prison, and for her the sobriquet of Split-Face Moll. At about this time, she wrote to Mr. Doman a touching letter of renunciation, enclosing her photograph to prove that she had no longer had a right to indulge the dream of becoming Mrs. Doman, and recounting so graphically her fall from a horse that the staid plug upon which Mr. Doman had ridden into Red Dog to get the letter made vicarious atonement upon the spur all the way back to camp. The letter failed in a signal way to accomplish its object. The fidelity which had before been to Mr. Doman a matter of love and duty was thenceforth a matter of honour also. And the photograph, showing the once pretty face sadly disfigured as by the slash of a knife, was duly instated in his affections and its more commonly predecessor treated with contumelious neglect. On being informed of this, Miss Matthews, it is only fair to say, appeared less surprised than from the apparently low estimate of Mr. Doman's generosity, which the tone of her former letters attested one would naturally have expected her to be. Soon after, however, her letters grew infrequent and then ceased altogether. But Mr. Doman had another correspondent, Mr. Barney Bree of Hurdy-Gurdy, formerly of Red Dog. This gentleman, although a notable figure among miners, was not a miner. His knowledge of mining consisted mainly in a marvellous command of its slang, to which he made copious contributions, enriching its vocabulary with a wealth of uncommon phrases more remarkable for their aptness than their refinement, and which impressed the unlearned tenderfoot with a lively sense of the profundity of their inventor's acquirements. When not entertaining a circle of admiring auditors from San Francisco or the East, he could commonly be found perusing the comparatively obscure industry of sweeping out the various dance houses and purifying the cuspidors. Barney had apparently two passions in life: love of Jefferson Doman, who had once been of some service to him, and love of whisky, which certainly had not. He had been among the first in the rush to Hurdy-Gurdy, but had not prospered, and had sunk by degrees to the position of gravedigger. This was not a vocation, but Barney, in a desultory way, turned his trembling hand to it whenever some local misunderstanding at the card table and his own partial recovery from a prolonged debauch occurred coincidentally in point of time. One day Mr. Doman received at Red Dog a letter with which the simple postmark Hurdy, Cal, and being occupied with another matter, carelessly thrust it into a chink of his cabin for future perusal. Some 2 years later it was accidentally dislodged, and he read it. It ran as follows: Hurdy, June the 6th. Friend Jeff, I've hit her hard in the boneyard. She's blind and lousy. I'm on the divvy, and that's me, and mum's my lay till you toot. Yours, Barney. P.S. I've clayed her with Scarry. With some knowledge of the general mining camp argot, and of Mr. Bree's private system for the communication of ideas, Mr. Doman had no difficulty in understanding by this uncommon epistle that de Barney, while performing his duty as gravedigger, had uncovered a quartz ledge with no outcroppings, that it was visibly rich in free gold, that, moved by considerations of friendship, he was willing to accept Mr. Doman as a partner, and awaiting that gentleman's declaration of his will in the matter, would discreetly keep the discovery a secret. From the postscript it was plainly inferable that in order to conceal the treasure he had buried above it the mortal parts of a person named Scarry. From subsequent events as related to Mr. Doman at Red Dog, it would appear that before taking this precaution Mr. Bree must have had the thrift to remove a modest competency of the gold. At any rate, it was about that time that he entered upon the memorable series of potations and treatings which is still one of the cherished traditions of San Juan Smith County, and is spoken of with respect as far away as Ghost Rock and Lone Hand. At its conclusion, some former citizens of Hurdy-Gurdy, for whom he had performed the last kindly office at the cemetery, made room for him among them, and he rested well. Having finished staking off his claim, Mr. Doman walked back to the centre of it and stood again at the spot where his search among the graves had expired in the exclamation, Scarry. He bent again over the headboard that bore that name, and as if to reinforce the senses of sight and hearing ran his forefinger along the rudely carved letters. Re-erecting himself, he appended orally to the simple inscription that shockingly forthright epitaph: She was a holy terror.